Okay. Hello, everyone. Hope you're all staying safe. And welcome to this week's Cultural Heritage Project Lemonade session. For those of you that are new to DTCH, we provide hardware, software, and services through our new partnership with Pixel Acuity for preservation grade imaging. And I'm Carol Wolczewski. I'm the Western Regional Sales Manager for DTCH and Pixel Acuity. Today's session is focus stacking and how to get the most out of your images. This too is an encore performance by Ben Cort, who has been the collections and exhibitions photographer at the Portland Art Museum. He began working at the Portland Art Museum in 2011, where he was tasked with constructing an in-house photo studio and implementing the associated workflows, procedures, and processes. In addition, he was tasked with broadening the curatorial-driven imaging and as well as exhibition documentation and conservation imaging of collection items. He has continued to grow the quality of traditional imaging at Portland Art Museum, as well as expand the studio's capabilities to include UV, IR imaging, photogrammetry, and RTI. Ben is active in several professional imaging organizations and is currently the chair of the Museum Computer Network, MCN's Digital Imaging Special Interest Group. So please welcome Ben Cort, and Ben, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Carol. Just wanted to give a special thank you to all of the Digital Transitions folks for putting these webinars on and hosting them and giving us all something to watch and do while we're all staying at home and staying safe. So as Carol mentioned, we're going to be talking today about focus stacking for museums. So what is focus stacking? Focus stacking is enhancing the depth of field through stacking multiple images at different focal distances. So much like we'll do panorama stitching, focus stacking is basically just stitching in the across, like front to back in your image. That's the easiest way to think about it. So what we're all here for, what can focus stacking do for you? I would argue that there's probably, for a museum or a cultural heritage library, there's probably four main reasons that you'd want to be doing focus stacking. So the first is really image usability. We have these great cameras that have the ability to look at areas that are not intended to be the focus of the image. Oftentimes as photographers, photographing 3D objects, we'll focus on the very front of the object and the rest of it will sort of fall where it will. Focus stacking will help us to reveal additional details and encourage a deeper engagement with the object. As you can see here, this is sort of a view of the front of this focus stacked bowl. You can see on the left side of the image where we sort of focused on the front and the rest of it sort of falls where it will. You can see focus falling off towards the back versus on the right where it's carrying through. And in the back of the image where the non-focus stacked image basically just serves to prove that the bowl is there and the pattern continues, but it's not useful beyond that. The focus stacked image really allows us to dive right in, see what's going on with that pattern, and really identify with the object a little bit better. The second key reason that we've got is image fidelity. Focus stacking really helps to overcome the inherent shortcomings of depth of field in the digital systems. Back in the day with view cameras and 4x5, 8x10, all that good stuff, you could really stop down your lens as far as it would go. You could go f32, f64, f128 if a lens went there. But with digital, because of the way the sensors are made, we really can't do that. The imaging systems are really happy at one aperture, usually f8, f11, somewhere in there. And that's about it. You can definitely go higher than that. You can go, f22, f32. But the digital camera systems really suffer from something called diffraction, where while your depth of field is getting deeper, your overall image crispness goes down. So you might have your whole object in focus, but it's not really sharp. The whole thing is kind of hazy and fuzzy and not really ideal. You'll see on screen now, I hope, that the bottom right corner of the image is nice and crisp, where the top left corner is out of focus just a little bit. If you're having trouble seeing this, I would recommend that everyone toggle over to the handouts and download the slides. They are available, and if you're having trouble with your connection, I encourage you to take a look at those and sort of follow along with that instead. Since we're talking about image quality and fidelity, if you can't see high quality images, it's sort of not great. But anyway, with this particular image, this is a gilded frame on a painting, and obviously we've prioritized the painting to be in focus. Hence why the frame closest to the painting is more or less sharp, where as it sort of becomes a higher and further away piece, it gets out of focus. I call this sort of a 2.5D object. It's more or less flat, but it has potential to be treated and lit as a 3-dimensional object. If we had done focus stacking on this, we would have a nice sharp image through and through, and we'd be able to use the image a little bit more for analysis and for treatment and all that. I find that this is a useful technique as well on curling prints and negatives, particularly fiber prints, where you've got image data, image information all the way to the edges, but the RC or the fiber paper will sort of do a curve like this. If you have a situation where your conservation department doesn't want you to flatten that, but you need to see crisp data edge to edge, focus stacking can be a way around that. And that leads us nicely into object safety. All of our museums and cultural heritage institutions house objects that are one of one. Even if it's in a series or an edition of prints, the object that we have is still the only version of that specific object. Therefore, it's really super important to maximize the imaging potential while we have it in our studios, on our copy stands, etc. Focus stacking allows the most thorough engagement with, or the most thorough survey of an object. By maximizing the depth of field, we're able to orient objects for object safety rather than maximizing their orientation to camera to get the most depth of field. Because we get a nice crisp edge around our object, we're able to do better masking, we're able to remove supports, weight bags, anything like that that might be needed. We don't have sort of fuzzy overlapping areas that are going to be an issue there. It also helps to limit repeat object handling. When you have a researcher who can view the object as a digital surrogate rather than needing to come in and handle your object, that's just a win. When you have objects that are photographed in such a way that curators can really engage with and look at areas that they hadn't considered, they don't need to request the object be brought back out to be rephotographed, to be re-observed, re-handled. It's a good thing for everyone to make the most of the time while you have the objects out. And finally, it's necessity sometimes. A lot of our collections include small objects, miniatures, natural specimens that require a really up-close and personal view. Particularly where you have insects, beads, jewelry. The only way to get a really crisp image in that is with focus stacking. Particularly with the sub-miniature objects. Particularly this is a Japanese net ski that we had on loan a few years ago. It's about 1 inch tall. It's really tough to engage with these objects as a curator, as a researcher, without magnification and without hanging onto them. Being able to have really crisp close-up details is really important. Otherwise, there's things you can't see with the naked eye that have become apparent with high-resolution images that are crisp through and through. I've gotten a lot of good feedback from researchers and from curators that the focus stacked images are just as useful as some of the stuff we can pull off of our microscopes. The microscopy images are great for really specific details, but people seem to really appreciate the context of the focus stacked image where you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can sort of, if we're going to zoom in on his eye, you get the context of the broader piece rather than just sort of the detail of the eye that might come off the microscope. So here's the detail of that particular net ski. You can see in here really nice detail that you can't see in the previous image. Details like the whiskers, the nose, the teeth, the iris, the eyes, the details that are involved therein. It just makes it a nicer viewing experience. It helps your public engage with the image more. It helps everyone engage with this piece that might otherwise miss out on details of. So, to the meat of this presentation, how it works, how I do focus stacking in a museum setting. Focus stacking is one of these processes. There's a lot happening to it. It can feel complicated, it can feel unapproachable, but it's really a pretty basic technique, and then you can build upon the basics of that. So starting out, you need some equipment. We're doing digital capture, so we obviously need a digital camera. So long as it's digital and you have some form of manual control over your focus, you can focus stack with it. I've used DSLRs, I've used the phase 1 cameras, I've used Hasselblads, lots of options in this category. It really depends on what you have access to. If you want to start working on focus stacking, as long as you've got a camera, you're good. You need a tripod. You need some way to stabilize your image. Because we're moving focus over a really small object sometimes, we're moving the focus millimeters, microns, the smallest amount possible on the lens barrel. Any left-right translation of the camera, forward, back, up, down, if you're shooting like this, you're just gonna have problems. The image here is the studio at the Portland Art Museum. We've got our focus stand, we've got our phase 1 system, nice, heavy, fully locked down. Just a nice way to do these. A regular tripod will work just fine, just don't kick it. Any wiggling or any movement that you introduce is just going to cause issues down the line with your stitching software. So speaking of software, you're going to need some. You can hand stitch. I'm sure there's some people attending today that have been doing this for years and have hand masked together focus stacked images. You can certainly do it. It's difficult. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not a way I would recommend trying to get into this process. If you want to prove sort of a minimum viable product, if you want to just show people how it works, Photoshop can do it. There are YouTube videos, there's tutorials on how Photoshop will do it. It's not the best. It's sort of, you've got a Swiss Army knife with a can opener, but you also have a can opener. You've got specific tools to do the job. I would recommend you invest in a specific tool for focus stacking. And then there's automatic control. And I put an asterisk next to this because you don't need it, but it makes it a heck of a lot easier. If you've got a system that has automatic control built in, such as the phase 1 XF body, that's great. Use that. If you don't, there's nothing stopping you from testing out focus stacking and seeing how it works. So, capture. There's 2 tracks, more or less, that this can be broken out into. Automatic control with a product like Helicon Remote for DSLRs or the phase 1 XF systems. I think the newer Hasselblad 50Cs, the mirrorless solution they've got, has some of the stuff built in, but I haven't used that, so I can't speak to it. But there's also always the good old manual or computer-assisted version. And really the only thing that separates these 2 capture techniques is the camera system. The principles are going to be the same. The techniques are going to be the same. It's just that the computer is going to solve some of your problems for you that you might have to do with the manual capture. With both of these techniques, you're going to have to set a near focus point and you're going to have to set a far focus point. If you're using Capture One with Live View or any kind of Live View software, you can usually set those in your viewer windows. If you're going to do manual capture, I recommend a piece of white gaff tape to mark on your lens barrel the near and the far points. It's really helpful to know where you want to start and where you want to finish, and then being able to divide out from there. With the automatic capture, Helicon Remote is a great product that will calculate how many shots you need based on where you started to where you finished. It does sort of some math, but mostly it says we've moved forward X increments and we're going to divide X increments into however many shots we think we need. With a system like the Phase 1 XF, the lens is indexed with the camera body, so the camera body knows where the lens is in its focal range, which is really nice because, as we know, focus isn't a linear scale. As we're closer to infinity, the same lens barrel movement will net us a further shift of our focus than our focus shift at the close end of our range. So when you're setting the camera in Phase 1, it's moving the camera in correct increments, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, based on where it knows it's at. So it'll calculate an optimal number of images that it needs to cover your range. With the manual method, you just sort of need to wing it. I find when I've done the manual method, it's really difficult to move the lens barrel in small enough increments. So what I would recommend is you move it in as little steps as you possibly can while still advancing the lens. I really would recommend you using some sort of live view program for this. Almost every camera manufacturer sends some kind of built-in camera control. I know EOS Utility works for this. I've used that before. Nikon has camera control that works. I don't know about Sony, but I imagine they've got something. But they've got their autofocus buttons. You can use those to toggle through as well. Though that's going to be better. Anytime you can limit touching the camera, you're going to see dividends on that. You're going to see a much better result. The software is going to have a better time building your depth maps. One thing to know with manual method, or if you're manually focus shifting, you want to aim for about a 1/3 overlap of your image. Just the same as when you would be doing a left to right panorama. You need something for the software to latch onto. If you sort of have a photo here and a photo here and they butt together, there's nothing for the cameras to register. The software can't figure out the orientation, even if it's obvious to the human eye. The algorithms in the software don't know what to do with it. And since we're just building a depth panorama, essentially, we need to have sort of that same overlap. Another thing to remember for manual capture is let the camera settle. Automated systems will sort of build in a little bit of a pause, and because they're just automatically rotating the barrel for you, it's a smaller movement than if you're over there jostling the camera. Anytime you can, again, limit motion, limit sort of the shifting. The software can deal with a little bit of it, but not enough to make it really worth it. I'm sure there's some people over here asking about color management for this. There's been some really good discussions about color management on these webinars previously. For these, because basically at the end of the day, all we're doing is a ton of captures of a single 3D object, it's really easy to carry forth the color management systems that you've laid out for traditional capture of a 3D object. For us, what I'll use is either a golden thread object level target or a color checker, depending on what I can fit in the image. I prefer the OLTs because they're self-described and it's a little bit easier to track image quality through the software. But it's, because there's not as many standards with 3D capture, it's a little bit easier to fudge. So we talked a little bit about all of the near and far focus points. I just want to show you what that sort of looks like in practice. And this is the object we saw over here that we're photographing. And this nice little, it's a Native American ornamental clay piece. So you can see here in the Capture One live view, we're setting a near focus point and we're setting a far focus point. One thing to remember with setting your near and your far points is that they may not be logically consistent with what you expect. With this particular piece, there's a little lug on the side that's actually sticking out further than the lip. So if we were to set our near focus point on the lip of the ceramic, we would be missing out on some of the potential image. Same thing with the far focus point. It's on this sort of flank of the piece where it wraps around itself. These can be pretty tricky to set. I find what's really helpful with this is if we go back a couple slides, you can see how the camera's on an angle. If we look at the object from the side, sort of perpendicular to our imaging axis, it's easier to see sort of where the image plane is going to hit and where it's going to intersect with the object first and last, and then build that in. It's pretty helpful, particularly when you have complicated objects or objects that you are just having a hard time finding, like where your focus point actually is set at. Was photographing a mask a few weeks ago, and I was focusing on the face, and I actually had some ornaments that came out in front a good bit, and I didn't think to capture that as the near point. And when I built the focus stack, it was a mess, and those were out of focus, and it was really frustrating. So if you're having problems, it's a good thing to just sort of take the side-on view of your set and see what is actually coming into focus first. So file editing. We've got all these files. What are we going to do with all of them? Well, at the museum, I use Capture One. So I'm lucky to be able to just sort of follow along with my same Capture One workflow. If you're using the remote programs or like a EOS utility program, that your workflow might be different as far as importing, but you should be able to follow along with any of your existing processes for processing three-dimensional photography. The one caveat here is that any adjustments you make have to be applied globally. The same way we're talking about, you can't shift or translate the camera, you can't shift or translate image settings. If you were to adjust exposure or white balance, for example, you would need to apply that to all the images of the sequence. Otherwise, you'll cause a registration error. Same thing with like a crop or with a rotation. You're just introducing that wiggle after capture, which is frustrating, particularly if you've taken a lot of care and effort to not jiggle your camera around. So for this, I might do a little exposure correction. I'll do a white balance adjustment based off of my color targets. I'll probably do a crop, particularly if I have a bunch of extra canvas. When you process these files through the focus stacker, it has to process all the pixels. So anytime you can get rid of extraneous data, you're gonna have an easier time processing. I will rename. We have a specific naming convention that I'll share with you in a little bit. And we'll export the files as 16-bit TIFF. We use Helicon Focus, which will throughput whatever bit depth we give it, so we just feed it the 16-bit TIFFs. So a quick note on software. We use Helicon Focus, but there are other options. I just wanted to share with those of you really quick. Photoshop, which is available to probably all of us. I'm sure everyone here has some version of Photoshop available to them. That's a great product for just if you want to test it out, if you want to share with people why it's cool, if you want to just do a really quick build, Photoshop is a great option. But I definitely, if you decide that you want to pursue focus stacking with more, like a bigger project, a larger scale, Helicon Focus or Zareen Stacker are going to pay dividends just in the efficiency that they've got. Helicon, I think, is maybe a little more widely used, and it's got really good documentation. The interface feels a bit more modern. I think Zareen Stacker feels a little Windowsy. I think some of you will know what I mean by that. Helicon's got a great set of automated solutions. They've come out with a couple of really cool hardware solutions recently that are worth checking out, particularly for the DSLR options. And if you have to do focus stacking in galleries and don't have access to a computer, I think their new solutions are pretty exciting for that. They have like iPhone control of your camera. It's great. They also have the Helicon remote, which allows you to tether in with Canons, Nikons, and Sonys. And they also have a Lightroom plugin, and I believe they've got some. I can't remember the exact integration they've got with Capture One, but there is a version that works well with that. Zareen Stacker is a very comparable product. Also has a Lightroom plugin, and it's great for deep stacks. There's no upper limit on the level of the number of images you can stuff into Zareen Stacker. As a result, I think it's probably the preferred tool for people doing scientific imaging, for people doing images off of microscopes that have thousands of images in them. Helicon, I think, will do it, but I don't have experience with that. And I know that people have touted Zareen's ability to deal with 1,000 image plus stacks. But But since we use Helicon, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So there are 3 rendering methods for Helicon. And primarily I'll use method C, which is the pyramid method. It really excels with complex shapes and overlaps. This is one of those things where all 3 of these methods are going to have strengths and weaknesses, and it's going to be up to you to figure out what works well for your objects. The pyramid method, or method C, works really well when you have objects that sort of are on top of themselves, occluding themselves. But it can cause issues if you're not careful with contrast and color, particularly on high key images. And that's just because of the way the algorithm identifies what's in focus. It picks out sort of high frequency, high key areas and prioritizes that. So if you've got like that bowl we were looking at the very first slide, where you've got bright white on top of black, it's going to cause issues with contrast, and it's going to make them artificially more contrasty than you want. In that instance, method A, which is the weighted average, prioritizes over all of these methods color and contrast fidelity. It doesn't do as well with the overlap. It doesn't do as well with really large stacks, large in this case being over 100 images. But again, it's a pretty good, nice method for that. Method B, which typo here, it should be depth map, not mat. That slipped by my editing fingers. But it's it really, really works well for smooth or featureless objects, particularly if you have like marbles or things that don't have a lot of texture to them. The pyramid method can have a hard time latching on to what's going to be in focus without making your contrast go through the roof, where it's identifying those like little edgy, crunchy bits. The depth map does a really nice job identifying the smoother areas of focus. I don't use this a whole lot. We don't have a need to at the museum. We don't have a lot of these smooth objects we're trying to focus stack. And also it's really, really tricky to optimize with the manual methods. Because of the way it works, it really benefits from sequence and order and sort of saying focus is this big throughout the entire image, which you can't do if you're manually capturing. But it is a really great option. And I recommend, with all of these methods, there's tweaks, there's pieces you can adjust on them. And I recommend, particularly as you're learning focus stacking and sort of working out how to do it, I recommend experimenting a lot. It's a pretty approachable software. This is the Helicon 5 or 6, one of their previous versions. They're on a new version now. But it's pretty basic software. You've got in the center here, you've got your preview panel. You've got on the right side your image source pile. And then you've got your rendering intents. There's not a lot to it. And this isn't, a press render and then have to leave to go, wait overnight for your file to be dealt with. It's, it's not like a photogrammetry file where you press play and then come back 2 days later. This is a get up, get a glass of water, get up, go read an email real quick. It really promotes messing around with it and seeing what results you can get, sort of what's going to work best for you. So this is a zoomed in view of that same basket we were just looking at. Sort of the focus stacked on the left and an image slice on the right side. You can see this. So this was stacked with the method C pyramid technique. And you can see in the very front where when it goes out of focus, the fuzzy area starts to occlude this area in the center. And so you can see how the method C does a really great job prioritizing fidelity in that area. And then in this, because it's a relatively low contrast object, we don't have any issues with contrast or color shifting left to right across the split. It's done a really great job dealing with those things. But again, if you're having issues with it, I definitely recommend exploring. This stack probably took 5 minutes to render out on a relatively out-of-date computer. It's really easy to experiment and play around and see what's going to work best for the object that you have on hand. So just some errors that you might run into when you're processing. Occlusions and halos, you can see sort of where it occludes here. there, as you know, you might have seen this as you're dealing with focusing, there is sort of a magnification zoom effect as you roll focus through an object. Particularly with some more complex objects, those occlusions can get to be pretty dramatic. And what you'll see is these little sort of JPEG artifact looking halos around those edges, and you'll just want to be aware of that. It's something to look for as you're going through that process. You want to make sure that you are just identifying those areas of concern, because they can come back and they look really, really strange when you've got this nice tack sharp image through and through, and then you have like one square section that's just out of focus blur. We talked a little bit about color and contrast shifts. This is where having color targets in your image is really helpful. It really lets you compare your exported file with your input files and just make sure that everything matches up at the end. One thing we haven't really talked about is misregistration, particularly if you're doing multiple views of objects with stacks. It's really easy, and particularly if they're similar looking, it's really easy to grab, you know, the left side and then add a right side image into it. Sometimes it's brutally obvious when you have a registration error, and sometimes there's the little ghosting, there's little shifts as you as the software like tries to cram stuff together. So things to look out for, just things to be aware of as you're moving forward. It's by no means an automatic process. There are user controls and user quality checks you have to perform, but broadly they're pretty obvious. They're not going to be terribly subtle when you have an issue. It's going to kind of hit you, sort of like that image in the very first slides where it's like, oh, like this is different looking. This isn't going to work. So I mentioned file naming. I just wanted to give you a quick concept of how we do that. This text might be tough to read on your screen, so I recommend downloading the handout. All we're basically doing here is we're using the object accession number for the first part of the file name, a year, month, day for the second part to identify when we photograph it, and then a view number. So we can see this is the 01 view. Usually we'll shoot 4, 5, 6 views of an object, not necessarily all focus stacked, but we'll shoot a number of views. So when we're focus stacking, I'll append this _S 2-digit counter. This is just important because it identifies that to me as a stitched image, and then it identifies each image's place in the stack. This is pretty important, particularly for the digital SLR users. The phase 1 XF has a metadata tag that tells you that it's part of a stack, and it tells you where that image is in the stack. But EOS, your Canon EOS utility and Nikon camera control don't have that. So it's important to identify where you are. And a lot of the rendering intents require a sequential file structure. So if you just dump all these in there and they get sorted somehow, by date exported or aperture, some weird non-sequential format, you can run into issues. So just having this counter becomes really handy. So storage, which is always a topic of concern, particularly for focus stacking. It's not, you don't get quite as many files as you do with, say, RTI or a photogrammetry project, but you definitely get some data. Apart from those two processes, this is probably the most file size intensive process, particularly when you're shooting with 100 megapixel, 150 megapixel digital backs, multi-shot, 200 megapixel things. It gets to be a lot of data. So specifically for us, we're lucky we get to store raw files as EIPs. We store our raw files for 1 year on a retention schedule on a local server. There's been a lot of debate if we want to store these longer or not. At the moment, we're not in a position where we can store additional raw files. We made the decision to store 16-bit TIFFs for preservation. And we just gave up on storing the raw files for more than a year. We're pretty excited about that. There's some debate about if a raw file is useful past a year. That's a decision for you and your institution to make. As far as the result files, the file will be dumped out of Helicon as a 16-bit. Again, it just throughputs bit depth. If you give it 8-bit, it'll output 8-bit. If you give it 16-bit, it'll output 16-bit. So we save a 16-bit, and then we'll, in Photoshop, go back and make an 8-bit file. The 8-bit file gets put into our DAM as the access file in our database, as well as on our online collections. And we'll save the 16-bit file as our preservation file. We don't save the component pieces. The basket that we just looked at is 40 images. If we wanted to save all 40 of the 16-bit TIFFs, that's 20 gigs for one of the 5 views that we did. 100 gigs of storage in perpetuity is unreasonable for us. And I feel pretty good about sort of the level of detail and the accuracy of the image moving forward to be a 16-bit preservation file. Like, I feel pretty good about that. Again, like, there are issues with the translation of the object. There's always going to be issues, particularly with 3D, because descriptive lighting doesn't really have color standards at this point. I know, Scott at the Met is working on developing some of those, and there's some smarter people than me working on that, but we're not there yet. So maybe one day we'll get there. Anyway, back on track. I feel pretty good about saving those 16-bit files. There's always going to be issues with translation, but that's inherent to a 3-dimensional imaging idea. So we just got to move forward with it. So sort of to sum this all up, what do we get out of focus stacking? We get some pretty amazing levels of detail. We get a new level of engagement with our audience because they have just that much more information about the object. And it's just, I think it's just the optimal way to photograph these objects. On the downside, there's always going to be downsides. To any process we do, there's going to be a downside. You get relatively large data sets. Again, not as big as photogrammetry or RTI, but it's a not insignificant amount of data that you're making. It is time consuming. There is, it's an extended capture time. There's more processing time. Your transfer times will go up because you're moving more data around. On aggregate, it is a more involved process. You need to, particularly if you're going to try to do a whole collection, you need to consider that as you're moving forward. It does require a skilled operator. It's not a hugely complicated process, but it's not something that you can just sort of throw at imaging tech. There's a QC process. There's a little bit of learning to be done. It's not just like, all right, like bang through 200 of these scarabs today. We're going to focus stack them. You're like, okay. You need to do a little bit of training, of work with the tech. But after you've done that, then they've got a new skill and they're capable of producing these great images. There are implications on remaining true to the object with this process. You can't guarantee 100% accuracy. Again, the translation and scaling with racking focus is unavoidable, but I think the level of detail makes up for that. Really complicated objects that have a lot of occlusion can result in some more time-consuming post-processing needing to be done, particularly feathers, fabrics, things that can blow around with studio HVAC. You just need to be aware of that. But I think the level of detail that you get out of these images for a relatively low initial investment, this is $100 in software and tools that we already all have access to. I think you get really excellent results out of your images, and I think it's something to really investigate, particularly on sort of the highlight pieces of a collection. Is it good for everything? No. Would I use it on every object we photograph? No. But it's definitely got a place, and it's definitely something that we should be investing in and working on and getting better at as we move forward. And with that, I think, Arnab, we're ready to open up for questions.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Great.
I can hear you.
See me with my crazy quarantine hair too. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Ben. We have lots of great questions from the chat, and so I'm going to go ahead and we'll start from the beginning.
Perfect.
So first of all, we have a couple of people asking, in general, how long does it take you to stack and process out a single image? Somebody was asking about like a vase or something. So let's say you have, a vase that you need to shoot. about how long would you say that takes?
It's definitely faster with the phase 1 systems. With the Canons, it probably adds on the capture side of 10 or 15 minutes. With the phase 1, it's probably closer to 3 to 5. And that just has to do with opening up new software and setting your focus points. With, you're already lighting the object, it's already out, the camera's set up, you're already doing most of the setup time. So yeah, adding probably 3 to 5 minutes for the phase 1 and then a little bit longer than that just because of different softwares.
And so that's for the acquisition time? Okay.
Yeah. So then for processing, it's a little bit longer again. I do the processing for focus stacks on export. So everything will be exported from my Capture One session, and then I will go do the processing. And that probably adds half an hour on aggregate if I've got 5 or 6 stacks to do. I try, because it's sort of a mindset for the QC side of it, which is I'm doing all of the QC for my images. I'll wait until I have a couple of days saved up for sort of to open the software and dive in. So it's probably, to get one focus stacked image out, it's probably another half an hour added on. Which again, it's not something that I do for every piece of the collection, but when it's a particularly high profile piece or something that a researcher has specifically requested, or if I get a curator that's not sure what they want to see in the image even, I'll do this process, particularly if it requires a lot of lighting setup. So.
Got it. And that does answer actually another question that someone had, which was, do you focus stack all of your images? And so you said that you don't. What percentage would you say, if you have like a rough estimate?
It's getting to be more and more with the phase system just because it's such an easier system to deal with. We're probably at this point doing 3. So on an average day for 3D images, we'll shoot probably 30 objects, and we're doing focus stacking probably on 5 to 10 of those a day.
Okay.
I don't know how that works out to percentage-wise, but particularly with we've been doing a lot of these Native American baskets that are really large, and being able to see the weaving detail across the whole object is really important. So we're doing a lot more of that now. I would love to do it on everything. It's just not feasible with our constraints that we've got.
Absolutely. Now you mentioned lighting, and there have been several questions about that. So do you have like a recommended lighting setup? Do you have like constant lights, strobes? Have you experienced any issues with lighting based on like the focus movement of the lens or the camera? Kind of talk to us about that.
Yeah. All right. So I have opinions about this. So at the moment I use strobe. Strobe is great, except for the one time in 1,000 where my ProPhoto D1 decides that it's, for whatever reason, going to fire off at a completely different intensity than every other time it's done that for the day. So you'll be going along, and then you'll have like the 54th image of the stack will be dark. What happened there? Just as you're going through with QC, be aware of that. That is a problem that I've experienced, which is really strange. Constant light is great. There probably are, particularly for tungsten lights, there's probably some image or some object safety concerns just because it's spending that much more time under the light. And then as well with your exposure times can be problematic, particularly if you have objects that have like wispy edges or feathers. I've run into problems with using LEDs with a little bit longer capture times where the HVAC in my studio will be blowing feathers back and forth, which doesn't work for a lot of things. Focus stacking particularly, where you're trying to get that sort of crispy edge all the way through.
Right.
I tend to default in the studio to strobes. I was a lighting tech before I was a museum photographer, so I'm comfortable with those. But again, I recommend using what you have available. I don't think you need anything different than what you're already using for 3-dimensional capture. You can really just move right along. I wouldn't let your lighting be the thing that holds you up from doing this process.
Got it. So in theory, it doesn't really matter. It's just kind of in practice, you got to make sure the light stays constant and that you've got the right exposure times and such, right?
Yeah, and I think making sure, you know, things aren't moving around, making sure that stuff is consistent. That's, you know.
And have you ever had issues with, I mean, I haven't personally, but with like, you know, on the XF, the lens is moving. Has that ever caused a difference in lighting from one frame to another?
I haven't experienced that
me neither.
yet. I imagine at some of the higher magnifications, like if we're going on a 1-to-1 or more than that, where you're going to start to get affected like a bellows loss, or if you're doing, well, you wouldn't get bellows loss because you'd be using a rail system. So anyway, but I imagine that point you would start to see that. I haven't experienced that, so I don't know how dramatic it would be though.
Yeah.
So again, it just anything that's you just want to be aware of all these little things, like anything that could potentially adjust your image, you need to be aware of. And since we're moving and we have a moving variable in our systems, we want to make sure of sort of everything is as consistent as we can make it.
Absolutely. So now we've got a ton of questions, of course, about dealing with occlusions and halos, right? I mean, I think that's probably the #1 troubleshooting issue that I've run into when I do focus stacking. And we've also had some questions about kind of like the radius and the smoothing and using different methods that way, and how those all kind of interact, right? So could you give us a little bit of you know, some insight on the QC process and how you avoid those or deal with those?
Yeah. So generally, without getting too crazy into the like technicality stuff, radius is effectively like a sharpening thing. If you're getting a lot of haloing, you can increase your radius and you'll get sort of a crispier edge, but you'll get rid of the fuzzy halos. That's just it's really hard to set these things as like a hard and fast rule. They really require you play around with it, which is great because render times on the hardware are so fast that you can like, oh, like I'm getting a little halo, like I better increase my radius. Like, oh, that's too much. Like, can I come back a little bit? And there's gonna be trade-offs there. As far as dealing with really severe occlusions, I find that if it's really bad, sometimes the only thing you can do is go back in and physically mask out what you need. Helicon's got some really good masking tools now. I think version 7's got some more effective tools. And there are ways to get your image stack into Photoshop if you have to go in with a pen tool and go through and do that. Again, it's an automatic process. There's always going to be a little bit of issue with that. I would say, you know, if you're having really hard occlusion problems, you know, trying out a method that's going to benefit those. Method C in Helicon, I think Zareen has a occlusion preferred method as well. And then fiddling with those settings, the radius being one, smoothing. I don't mess around with smoothing a ton. I think that's more useful on the depth map version. I'm by no means an expert on the Helicon software. I know how to use it, but they've got a great help user manual that I recommend. Yeah.
I'll actually
like really diving in. It's one of these. It's like any software; it can do so much more than we expect. But yeah, so definitely messing with the radius will help with the haloing, and then using the pyramid method to help with occlusions. And then at the end of the day, sometimes you just have to go back in and say, "I need this chunk to be sharp," and we're moving forward.
Awesome. So there were a couple of other questions about raw files and the way that you kind of work. Ooh. Yeah, okay. I see. You've already got some thoughts on this. So a couple of questions. Sorry.
I'm just interested to hear what the questions are going to be. I was expecting raw files to pop up.
So I mean, one of the questions is, you know, why do you use Capture One first and not use Helicon Focus with the raw stacking to shoot like DNGs? I have some personal thoughts on DNGs that I will leave off the table. But if you want to talk a little bit, because you did mention you shoot everything raw in Capture One, you do your global adjustments, color corrections, etc., and then you go to a 16-bit TIFF workflow, right? Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So because we're shooting on the phase, I don't necessarily trust. So Helicon has DC raw built into it as a raw converter. So it will accept raw files just to go right in. I don't necessarily, I like the results that I get out of the Capture One export tool better, particularly for the phase. Like it's, they build the software, they built the camera, like they're going to talk to each other better than using like a DC raw converter. Because we're already using this workflow for the rest of our 3D collection, I feel pretty good about like that translation of exporting. If I was doing this with, I'd probably do it the same way if I was capturing with a DSLR using the Helicon remote, where I could bake in all my color, any of my profiling adjustments that I've got, any like DCP files that I wanted just cooked in from the start. There are, I don't know that I totally see an advantage of putting raw files through the software first if you've got a really good workflow already set up to get good color information out of a file already. I think the way I view the focus stacking as like an additional step to an existing file. Like any of my focus stacked slices, I can use those as a display file already. The focus is in a dumb spot, but I can each of those files is up to our standards from the get-go. So taking a bunch of files that are at my standards, putting them into Helicon, and then doing like a really quick exit thing, and just making sure my color cards are the same, I find is good enough for me. I know there's been some discussion when I gave this talk in Los Angeles. There was some talk about using the DNGs to get a DNG out, but yeah, this is how I'm doing it. Yeah. And I'm not gonna say that this is the only way, or it's the way you absolutely have to do it, but it's the way that I've decided makes the most sense for our workflows.
Yeah, and just to kind of chime in here, I've also found that once you've set, because you use an object level target, right? And so you include that. You've got your white balance set for your lighting condition. You've got your sharpening and everything set based on the PPI you're shooting at. So most of the stuff that the raw file is really good at letting you manage. You've managed, right? So going to a 16-bit TIFF, you're not really doing anything more with the file, right? You're not adjusting exposure or color or any of that stuff. You've done all that in the individual files, right? Okay.
Yeah. I think just to that point of like the idea of like, oh, I've got the raw file, so I can fix the problems that will be induced. Right. The focus stacking, I believe, in my opinion, it'll induce other issues. Like if you're going to have a contrast issue or a color issue induced by your render method, those aren't going to be things that can be fixed by the data that's in the raw file. That's going to need to be fixed by your render output method. The DNG isn't going to be able to fix that, like you red shifted the file because of the focus stack, or that it's way more contrasted. Like you could go back in and adjust that, but I feel that you're going to be able to adjust that just as effectively in Photoshop after the fact if you've got color targets involved in your workflow.
Got it.
So again, just the way that I've decided to do this, that I'm not going to advocate for one way or the other, but just sharing the way that I do this.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's always great to have discussion, about how to do these things. We had another question sort of on the raw file subject, just to kind of touch on real quickly. You mentioned that the raw file might not be as useful after a year. What did you mean by that?
Oh yeah, to elaborate on that. The way that we view that is that after a year, anyone that's going to look at the file and have opinions about how that file appears, curators always have different ideas about how something should look, whether it be different color shift, different contrast, different crops, all that. So we figure after about a year, anyone that's going to view the file that's going to have opinions on how the file has been rendered will have seen it, and those adjustments will have been included into the new working file. So we feel pretty good about after that 12-month period, ejecting that raw file to free up more disk space. And if there's something so catastrophically wrong with the file, like if it's out of focus, if the colors like that should be blue and it's definitely green, those need to be adjusted by rephotographing the object. That's not something that we can fix with the raw file.
Right.
And it's also a bit of a safety thing. At the point that we've had the file on our systems for a year, the file is in online collections, it's in our dams, it's in our cold storage, and it's in our geographically separate backup locations. So it's been dispersed. Versus prior to that year period, there's a chance that we have a server crash and we lose the past 2 months of TIFFs. We can go back to the raw files that are on a separate storage device. So there's a little bit of practicality, a little bit of data safety. So I hope that wasn't too rambling answered the question.
No, I think that was great. There are a couple of questions, and you talked about using the XF for focus stacking. So I'm curious if you've played around with the difference between shifting the camera focus, as the XF does, or shifting the entire camera itself to do the focus stacking. Or if you've used a view camera, even you can also shift the back, the rear standard, and I can talk a little bit about that. I love this stuff, but I'll let you hit on that.
Yeah. I haven't. The short answer, no. We've only messed around with shifting the focus. As far as I'm aware, traditionally speaking at least, moving the entire camera system on sort of like a screw drive system or some sort of axis shifting system, that's more designed for when you're doing like sub-macro photography. I'm sure there's some benefits as far as being able to adjust the that sort of zoom magnification translation error that happens when you're barrel focusing. But we haven't gotten into that yet. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can speak more to the benefits of moving the system versus moving just the lens focus.
Yeah,
plane.
so it's actually, I think it's super interesting. So if you've ever used a view camera, essentially what you're looking at is, you've got your front standard and your rear standard, right? So when you're moving the entire camera, right, you're keeping the sensor in the same spot relative to the lens, right? So that distance doesn't change. And it's actually that distance that sets the magnification ratio. And so exactly what you were saying about if you're at a really high magnification and you start moving that, the difference between like a 10x magnification and a 20x magnification is going to totally screw up your image, right? So you absolutely want to keep that magnification ratio the same. The shifting the focus of where the lens is changes the distance between the sensor and the lens, right? And so that shifts your magnification ratio. But what it doesn't change, yes, that changes your magnification ratio, but it has less of an effect on your perspective, right? So because your perspective is set by where your lens is. And then if you move the sensor as opposed to the lens and keep everything else the same, then you get changes in your field of view, right? So there are trade-offs to each one. There's no perfect way to do it. But depending on the magnification sort of regime that you're working in, and the subject matter that you're working with, and also, just the realistic constraints of how you're working with the particular camera system you have. There are certainly different ways to do it, and they're all going to benefit, in different ways. So that is a very, very good question. And I think that there's a good article on Zareen that Rick Littlefield wrote about this. I'll see if I can find it.
Yeah, and again, I think the Zareen being built to work more with these the rail systems that exist. Helicon Remote has some options to integrate with stepper motors and rails without too much additional work. But again, because a lot of the examples that I've showed are larger objects that we're working with.
Like
we don't have that. We don't have that need. I'm more interested in maintaining perspective over magnification factor because we're not at that point where like we're over magnifying things, but that might be something to look into if you're working on like that sort of cusp magnification. You're having issues with occlusions and haloing. You might be able to get around some of that by switching how you're changing the focus of the image.
Sure thing. And I was going to say, okay, I lost it. Anyway, back to questions for you, though. That's what this is all about. So let me see. What's our next question here? Can you talk a little bit about what your QC workflow looks like? I think this is something that everybody is wondering about, right? Because, shooting the stuff, if you got the rail, if you've got the XF, if you got Helicon Focus Remote, that's pretty straightforward. But when you've got the image stacked, what do you do to QC it?
So when I've got my image stacked, because I'm the only person doing initial image QC, there's people down the line that, our DAMs managers going like, the image is just flat out upside down. Like, how did that slip by? It's a textile, I'm not sure. I don't know which way's up. For the focus stacking, what I will do generally is I'll pull them into Photoshop because I have to make the 8 bits anyways. So I'll pull in my focus stacked version along with one of the slices and I'll overlay them. And then I'll do a quick toggle to see if my color numbers are dramatically shifting. Like 1-2 points in the lab space, I'm not super concerned about. If it's a big dramatic shift or like a visually identifiable shift, I'll get concerned. Because it's a one-person shop that we don't have a ton of formalized QC yet. We're not, with these images particularly, we're not, adhering to a Metamorphose or a FAGI standard for these, just because it's being a 3D descriptive lighting object, we can't really do that.
Right.
And I will make the note that to get the slices for the stack out of Capture One, they're going through our initial the initial QC of focus, of color, of exposure, of making sure that object level target is reading properly on the curves, of reading where I expect it to. So there's a couple steps that they have to sneak through to get out. The main check for the stacked image is referring back to an original sliced asset and just seeing if there's been a dramatic shift in scaling, in color, in contrast, and then again, and then checking the perimeter for occlusion, artifacting, halos. If usually when you're working with one of these objects, you can tell where you're going to have a problem.
Right.
So I'll go in and I'll check that and be like, oh, is that, I saw these feathers kind of shifting around. How am I doing on those feathers? How am I doing on that bar that went across the entire sculpture that I know is going to have an issue.
Right.
So yeah, it's a little bit, it's probably a little more loosey-goosey than a lot of people
here. Well, and I mean, that kind of feeds into the next question. And we're a little bit over the hour mark here, so we'll just take a couple more questions. But, and we actually talked, you and I, about you having been to some of the conferences, 2D, 3D, and Tani and Kevin actually talked about this a little bit last week with sort of image guidelines around descriptive lighting and focus stacking. Can you talk a little bit about your quality standards from a more objective perspective, along the FAGI and Metamorphose lines? It's a big question.
Yeah, this is all right, so this is my TED Talk next week.
Okay.
I wish. No, so descriptive lighting is going to be a whole big can of worms. I really, if you haven't seen Kevin and Tani's talk from last week, I had seen it in Los Angeles last year, and I tuned in again last week because it's just that good. They talk a lot about sort of making sure your lighting works for the object, and really that's my first and foremost concern, particularly with these three-dimensional objects, is making sure that the lighting works for the object. Focus stacking is a great enhancing tool. It's no substitute for a good initial image. If you're not starting with good foundation, you're not going to have a good final product. So nothing about focus stacking is going to enhance if it's lit suboptimally. We'll put it that way. As far as standards, I think at the 2D, 3D conference from 2015, they have or 2017, there's a really good three-dimensional object handbook that sort of is a nice starting point with a lot of lighting diagrams and a lot of ideas about like how things should look. When I'm embarking on like a new project, I'll look at the Getty website, MoMA's website, the Met. I'll look at other cultural heritage institutes that have done a lot of imaging to draw inspiration from. Like, what do I want this object to sort of represent as? Like, what canon of image am I trying to fit into?
Right.
If that makes sense. As far as color standards on the digital SLR side of things, we would use DCPs. We would use our color passport to make a camera and lens specific DCP profile. Now that we've moved to the phase 1, we're just using the canned phase 1 profiles, particularly with the variability of ICC and in situ targets. It's really not a practical solution for any form of 3D imaging, not just for focus stacking. To the other part of that question writ large, I don't believe that there is any standard generally for focus stacking. I think focus stacking, much like RTI or photogrammetry, gets out into this sort of wild west of a rendered image. One thing that we do include in all of our focus stack images are things that I've had to like build in Photoshop. We do have metadata tags that say that this isn't a one-to-one recreation of the object. This is built from a composite image. This is a digitally constructed image. We'll call that out. We'll identify that this isn't exactly how, like if you were to hold, the mug and then the focus stack of the mug, they might appear slightly different, and we'll identify that. But more or less, it's just, it's an aesthetic enhancement, I feel. So I'm just, the standards are, does this look good? Did this help the object?
Yeah.
I think if we can go back on the slides, this vase, a couple iterations of this vase, these little dimply textures looked like 10 grit sandpaper. They came out really harsh and really aggressive. And that's not what they look like in real life. And there's a little bit of effort to change the rendering intents to knock those down and make them less obvious, and just match the object a little bit more. But yeah, so definitely following along with any kind of color that you're already doing with three-dimensional imaging, and carrying that through the focus stack is about all you can ask to do, I think, until Scott Geffert invents a new ISO standard and we have something to aspire to.
We're waiting with bated breath. So I think that kind of wraps up the time that we have. Ben, if folks have additional questions, is there a way that they can get in contact with you?
How do we want to share? I'm happy to hand out my email.
Yeah, if you want to just put it in the chat, we can make sure that folks have that. And for those of you asking, there will be a replay available shortly after the session is concluded. So I think with that, okay, there we go. So Ben put it in the email. It is benjamin.cort@gmail.com for those of you listening on the replay. And again, I think that's the time that we have. So Ben, any last remarks?
I don't think so. If you have a camera at home, I recommend downloading a couple of these demos. Helicon and Zareen are available as demo programs. I recommend giving it a shot. If you're looking for something to play around with, this is a really easy thing to do with stuff you've got sitting around your house.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much, Ben. And we're looking forward to seeing you again soon once everything is wrapped up a little bit. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and be sure to check your email for the next installments of Project Lemonade, and we look forward to seeing you guys again soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Take care.